Welcome back to Movies Explained. Today's film is a 2023 action drama titled The Convert. Set in the 1830s, the movie begins at the Tasman Sea. With crashing waves and heavy thunderstorms, a ship struggles to sail. While Thomas Munro calms his squealing horse, the other men bring in the body of a man who was shot in the head. Munro decides to go up on deck to see what's going on, but a man upstairs tells him to stay below. Just then, a flood of water enters the ship and pours onto Munro. This makes him think twice about going back up, so he stays below. The next morning, the storm has calmed, and the sun is shining brightly. Kedgley gathers everyone aboard for a funeral for the dead man, Mr. Ridley. Munro is asked to give the benediction, in which he claims that only those who have been at sea truly grasp the enormity of the world and its vast distances. He reflects on the frightening realization of one's own insignificance. He also says that most men would flinch from this knowledge, yet they are compelled into the vacant spaces of the earth, knowing that one day, at some unforeseen hour, a great price might be demanded of them. After his short speech, in the name of Jesus Christ, the body is dropped into the sea. Later that night, while Munro is working, Kedgley shows up and praises Munro for his eulogy to the sailor. Kedgley believes Munro's words and actions speak of a man who has seen something of the world. Munro reveals that he is from a family of shipbuilders. Kedgley then picks up a book by Adam Smith and asks why a man of God is reading a book of a mercantile world. When Munro stays quiet, Kedgley tells him that he has come to the right place and that there's money to be made in the outcast corners of the world. The next morning, Munro is busy sketching Wenuku when Kedgley shows up again. He looks at the sketch and tells Munro that the boy belongs to royalty. He's the son of Akatarewa, the chief of the Ngati Ruapu Iwi, who bade Kedgley to teach him seacraft. Kedgley then calls Wenuku, giving him the wheel of the ship and instructing him to take them 3 points to starboard. Wenuku successfully does so, and Kedgley applauds him. Just then, a man shouts, "Land ho!" After asking Wenuku about the nearest safe anchorage, Kedgley instructs the crew to go ashore, find some timber, and replace the topgallant. Everyone laughs as they watch Munro using his horse to come ashore. Later, Wenuku examines his drawing and asks Munro about it. Munro then asks about the whale tooth that Wenuku is wearing and the marks on his face. Wenuku explains that the whale tooth is the voice of his father's god, while the marks on his face tell the story of his life so far. In the meantime, Kedgley and the others head into the forest to look for timber. There, Munro encounters a girl named Rangjamai who is holding a weapon. Initially, Rangjamai seems unfriendly, but when she sees that Munro is unarmed, she approaches him and pets his horse. Suddenly, several other aggressive men, speaking in Maori, show up, ready to attack Munro. Kedgley arrives just in time and rescues Munro from the situation. Kedgley explains that they didn't mean any disrespect by trespassing. After the incident, Kedgley asks the men for wood for repairs. Initially, the men demand Munro's horse, but they eventually settle for an axe in exchange. Later, Munro wants to set up camp until the ship is ready to sail again. He claims that if he's going to live in this country, he needs to acquaint himself with it. Kedgley is against the idea at first, but agrees after some convincing, and decides to leave Wenuku with Munro, although Wenuku is nowhere to be found. As Munro explores the area on his horse, he admires the beauty of the place. He then lies down to take a nap, but soon he hears a woman screaming in the distance. Munro wakes up as the screaming intensifies, and he hears a gunshot. In the distance, two tribes are fighting, brutally killing each other. It is revealed that Wenuku belongs to one of the tribes, and he introduces Munro to his father, Akatarewa. Akatarewa asks Munro what he wants, and when Munro asks for the lives of the people to be spared, Akatarewa claims he can do whatever he wants with them. Shortly after, Kedgley arrives with his men. Akatarewa thanks Kedgley for teaching his son, and Kedgley tells him to spare Munro's life since he's supposed to deliver Munro to Epworth. However, Munro is determined to save Rangjamai and her husband. Akatarewa asks what he has to offer to spare their lives, and Munro proposes his white horse in exchange, but Akatarewa declines, saying, "One horse, one life," and tells him to choose one or the other. Munro, unable to choose, watches in horror as Akatarewa gives the order to kill Rangjamai's husband in front of her eyes. This devastates Rangjamai, and before she can do something foolish, Akatarewa tells Munro to take her away before he eats them both. Munro brings Rangjamai back onto their ship, allowing her to use his room and provides her with some food. Meanwhile, a lay minister sent by the King of Britain arrives in the remote settlement of Epworth in New Zealand and is welcomed by Mr. Beauchamp. They both spend the night at the lodges, where Rangimai grieves the death of her husband. The next morning, Monroe checks up on Rangimai and then goes to the chapel, where he meets Reginald, who invites him to dinner. Back at the lodges, Monroe finds Rangimai sick. It turns out she's badly injured. Monroe tends to her wounds before heading out for dinner. During dinner, he tells the others about his father being a shipwright and how he mostly grew up in London. As for Epworth, he believes it feels like a little sculpture, with its true form yet to emerge. During the conversation, he also learned that the land has been rented by a local chieftain, Maianui, who is not considered a threat. Reports indicated there was a warlord launching assaults against other tribes and claiming their lands. This warlord is Akatarewa, whom Monroe has encountered personally. Monroe recounted the story of Rangimai, whose husband was brutally killed on Akatarewa's orders. The people are worried that with Akatarewa moving south, the future of the colony becomes uncertain. Monroe then asks the doctor to treat Rangimai, but he refuses, claiming they have very limited medical supplies reserved for the people of Epworth. Before departing, Bethany mentioned a woman named Mrs. Hegarty, who might be able to help Rangimai. Monroe sought out Mrs. Hegarty and described Rangimai's infected wound. Initially, Mrs. Hegarty turned him away, but later that night, she arrived at his door to see Rangimai. Surprisingly, Mrs. Hegarty recognizes Rangimai. After tending to her wounds, she prepares a drink for her called kawa kawa and recites a Maori incantation before leaving. The next day, Mrs. Hegarty returns to take care of Rangimai, who thanks her for her healing power. Later, Monroe hears a loud bell and notices armed men rushing towards the shore. Just then, Rangimai arrives chanting and walks towards her tribe, who have come to take her back. Turns out, the leader of the tribe is Rangimai's father, Maianui. Rangimai confronts her father about seeking revenge and asks which one of them has the head of the murderer. Maianui comforts Rangimai before brutally killing Akatarewa's men, despite knowing they are not responsible for killing her husband. Mrs. Hegarty then introduces Monroe to Maianui, explaining that Monroe is the holy man for the people of Epworth, and the one who not only saved his daughter, but also returned her to good health. Hearing this, Maianui decides that Rangimai should stay in Epworth to be tutored by Monroe. Before leaving, Maianui asks Pahirua to stay with Rangimai to protect her. The next morning, Monroe arrives at the chapel to spread the word of God. Soon, the chapel fills with people, and Monroe begins with a hymn while Rangimai and Pahirua stand in the back, watching in silence. In the chapel, people applaud Monroe for his service before leaving. Later, Monroe, along with Rangimai and Pahirua, meets Mr. Paget intending to preach to him. However, Mr. Paget does not seem to care about the chapel or Monroe's interpretation of the gospel. He claims that he's stuck in a trap thousands of miles away from civilization, surrounded by savages, with no way out except through fire and blood. Later, Rangimai is in the forest with Mrs. Hegarty, dancing and playing around. Meanwhile, back in the chapel, Pahirua seems to have developed a liking for Bethany, but her father is not happy about it. He talks to Monroe and argues that the difference in their beliefs is too vast to be reconciled. That night, Bethany meets Pahirua in the chapel, and they share an intimate moment. The next morning, Monroe is with Rangimai and Pahirua when Rangimai sees a pinned paper of a dance ceremony coming up and shows interest in participating. She has also learned to understand and speak English. That evening, Mrs. Hegarty helps Rangimai dress up nicely for the dance. However, the British are not pleased to see Rangimai. Everyone stares at them awkwardly as the two dance. During this, Horace orders a few men to kill Pahirua. Upon returning, they find Pahirua brutally killed in the chapel. Angered, Monroe confronts the British, and they promise to find the culprit, while Rangimai mourns his death. Later, after beating him to a pulp, Mr. Paget is forced to confess and is held responsible for Pahirua's murder, even though he denies hurting anyone when Monroe confronts him. They plan to send him to Australia for his trial. In the meantime, Rangimai and Mrs. Hegarty prepare Pahirua's body to send back to the tribe. Soon, Bethany arrives and urges to see Pahirua one last time. Bethany puts her hand on his chest and sobs in grief. Mrs. Hegarty and Rangimai accompany Monroe to deliver Pahirua's body back to his tribe. Before they leave, Monroe learns that Mr. Paget was found dead in his cell. apparently having taken his own life out of remorse. Horace wants Monroe to tell Maianui that justice has been done on behalf of his people, but Monroe refuses, knowing that Mr. Paget was framed for the murder. After walking miles, they stop for the night where Monroe sketches Rangimai. Upon asking, he learns that Mrs. Hegarty's husband was killed in a battle, and as a Pakeha woman alone, she had to live with the British. Soon, they arrive at the Maori tribe, and the natives mourn Pahirua's death. Surprisingly, Monroe is met with an impressive amount of understanding when he apologizes to Maianui for not being able to keep Pahirua safe. As a punishment to the Epworth people, Monroe suggests that Maianui raise their rent rather than more bloodshed. Later, Monroe explores the place and makes several sketches of people doing routine tasks such as eating and working. While talking to Mrs. Hegarty, he learns a lot more about the Maori tribe. Suddenly, he hears several gunshots, drops his sketchbook, and rushes to see what's going on. A Maori kid picks up the notebook and presents it to their elder, Aorangi. Meanwhile, Monroe discovers that the Maori themselves are responsible for the shooting. He is surprised to see them using British land pattern muskets. While looking through Monroe's sketchbook, Aorangi sees many images of death. When asked about it, Monroe reveals the truth about why he is so haunted by these memories. Before he found faith and devoted himself to kindness and peace, Monroe had a life-changing experience as a British soldier. He was ordered to kill a group of people without hesitation, seeing them covered in blood for the crime of not wearing red uniforms. The horrific sight of women and children who had taken refuge in a school deeply traumatized him. Monroe wanted God to punish him, but instead, he turned to the Christian belief in redemption and decided to atone for his sins by doing good deeds. Monroe hopes that sharing his story of regret will touch Maianui and his people. However, he doesn't fully understand the Maori view on such matters. For them, true redemption comes through revenge. After comforting Monroe, Mrs. Hegarty and he spend the night together. Following their intimate night, Monroe notices scars on her back. Mrs. Hegarty shares her story of how she ended up at Epworth, revealing that she was transported to Botany Bay for stealing flour and yeast. The crew mutinied, killed the captain, and raped all the women. Those who resisted were also killed. After that, the crew encountered a local Maori subtribe and murdered them. However, the ship was attacked, ransacked, and burnt, and everyone was killed and eaten. She was spared because she saved one of the warriors from the pigs, who turned out to be Maianui's brother, and she became his wife. The next morning, Munro watches the tribe preparing to defend themselves for when Akatarewa comes. He then notices Kedgley selling guns to the Maori. Monroe explains to the Maori that they must make peace with Akatarewa, otherwise their children will have no future. He promises to talk to Akatarewa. However, Maianui is convinced that Akatarewa won't listen and challenges Monroe to go to Akatarewa and convert him to the god of peace. If Monroe succeeds, the Maori will also follow his god. Later, Monroe meets Kedgley and confronts him about his selfish business of selling muskets to the Maori. He accuses Kedgley of being only interested in making money and exploiting the tribe's emotions around their wars. Kedgley is selling weapons to both Maianui and Akatarewa, without caring about the resulting deaths or the fate of the tribes. The next morning, Munro heads over to meet and convince Akatarewa when he finds Rangimai hiding inside his cabin. She has something to offer to Ngati Ruapu. Munro believes the same approach that convinced Maianui will work on Akatarewa and gives him Maianui's offerings. However, he doesn't understand the key differences between the tribes. Akatarewa is a warlord with unique responsibilities and views mercy as something to be exchanged. He not only rejects Monroe's peace offer, but also kills Kedgley for trying to deceive him by increasing the price of the muskets. The situation descends into chaos, resulting in several men getting killed from both sides. Just then, Rangimai arrives and saves Monroe from a man trying to kill him by shooting the man in the face. It turns out that the man was the same one who killed her husband. Soon after, they managed to flee on Monroe's horse. Meanwhile, Akatarewa and his people hijack Kedgley's ship. When confronted by Monroe, Rangimai explains that revenge and death go hand in hand. The next morning, Monroe and Rangimai arrived at the Maori tribe and informed Maianui that the ship hijacked by Akatarewa could transport many warriors. Monroe cautioned them that the ship was equipped with cannons and mortars that could overpower them. However, Maianui claims he has defeated many tribes with few people before, and even if they are overwhelmed by Akatarewa's forces, they are ready to die as warriors. Seeing their determination, Munro and Mrs. Hegarty join forces with Ngati Hau. Soon, the ship arrives with Akatariwa and his men, ready for the final battle. They begin shooting their cannons at the village, causing chaos. During the all-out war, Mrs. Hegarty gets fatally wounded while helping Munro reload the weapons. This devastates Munro, reverting him to his old self as a remorseless killing machine. In a surprising turn, Maianui's army, despite being outnumbered and facing tough challenges, triumphs over the formidable Akatarewa through clever strategy, a deep knowledge of their battleground, and a strong resolve to defend their ancestral land. Akatarewa accepts defeat with humility and honesty, showing his true bravery. He looks Maianui in the eyes one last time before he is executed with a blow to his head. However, his son, Uenuku, is spared and joins Ngati Hau. 4 years later, Munro, Wenuku, Rangjimai, and a few others arrive at Epworth to meet William Cornwell, His Majesty's representative. Rangjimai is now Wenuku's wife, and Munro serves as their counsel. William Cornwell informs them that His Majesty is aware of the tribe's support for Epworth and the trade routes established up and down the coast. He then warns them about the plan to designate a custom and excise post in Epworth to oversee trade in and out of the area. However, Munro asserts that this land belongs to Ngati Hau, and the king has no standing here. Munro states that the people are willing to negotiate, but His Majesty must pay rentals to appoint a custom and excise post in Epworth. The movie ends with the British noticing the traditional marks on Munro's face. When they ask about it, he tells them it is the story of his life. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe for more videos.